We've seen that Mark was writing potentially to slaves, Gentiles in Rome. We also saw that most probably the thing that he has more than the others in proportion are miracle stories. So the stories of Jesus' power. And where we see Jesus' power, particularly within the Gospel of Mark, is in the concept of exorcisms. There are more exorcisms in Mark's Gospel per chapter than in the other two synoptics. And what's an exorcism? Exorcism is the expelling of demons from people, to actually remove the evil spirit from them. Now, without getting into a debate about evil spirits and about whether they still exist or so on, what we need to understand is that the evil spirit is by nature that evil. And Jesus comes in and pushes them out. But pushes them out not in a way which would be angry or aggressive, but a way which just determines his power. And what it is, it's the power of good versus evil. And so if you really come down to what is Mark about, what is Mark trying to teach us? He's trying to teach us that it's good versus evil. Is good is embodied within Jesus and embodied with what Jesus does. That in bringing people into relationship again, he brings them into relationship with themselves, he brings them again into relationship with God, and he connects them into relationship with others. The obvious version of that is the demoniac from the Gadarene demoniac, where the man has been living among the tombstones, cutting himself, he's been bound with chains, effectively what we would call a terrible mental illness. But they understood it in terms of evil and in terms of demonic oppression. Jesus removes the demons, and all of a sudden the man is restored again. He's restored to God, he's restored to himself, and restored back to his community. So what Mark is about saying that in fact evil can be overcome with good. That good can overcome evil. And what an important message that is. What a cornerstone of the gospel message is that the cornerstone of the gospel message is that evil can be overcome. And not only that evil can be overcome, but by the time we get to the end of the gospel, we realize that evil has been overcome. And so that's a very important theme within Mark's gospel. It's a very important process that moves all the way through Mark's gospel, is to realize that process. And so when we're interpreting it, when we're reading each section of Mark's gospel, the question that must always be in the back of our minds is, how is this good overcoming evil? How is this restoring relationship? Because it's the restoration of relationship that in fact it's about. You can understand that for slaves, how important that would have been to understand. Because a slave had no relationship. A slave wasn't a person. A slave was a thing. And because of that, they therefore had to look at themselves and say, well, who am I? I'm nothing. I'm nothing better than a tool, than a piece of furniture. Into the midst of that word comes, no, you are loved. You are cared for. And that in fact, even the evil in which you live can be overcome by the good of Jesus Christ. It's an amazing word. But also you can see an appropriate word for that particular audience. We need to hear that same word for us today. That so often we're told how evil everything is. But it's not about evil. It's about relationship that Mark wants to restore us into. The other thing that Mark does a lot, and the methodology that Mark uses, is the concept of secrecy. Secrecy. And the thing with secrecy is that what Mark overly does is that every time someone is healed, Jesus says to them, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. Of course, they never listen to him. They tell him anybody, everyone, anyway. And often that impedes the work of Jesus. But all the way through the gospel, don't tell anyone. Until we get to chapter 16, verse 8. And it's such an interesting use of that motive, of that particular concept of don't tell anyone. Because finally, the thing that Jesus wanted was that we don't tell anyone until he has overcome evil in the resurrection. But what happens? Well, that final scene in chapter 16 is most probably a wonderful scene of drama. It's a wonderfully dramatic scene because the women come down to the tomb, they see the stone rolled away, they hear that he's risen from the dead, and their reaction is they run away and they don't tell anyone. Finally, at the end of the gospel, we have the opportunity to now tell everyone, and then we don't. I believe that Mark's gospel was meant to finish at verse 8. In fact, most manuscripts will tell you that verse 9 onwards actually was from a later hand. And you can almost imagine that some scribe didn't like the fact that the women just ran away. They wanted to have some closure, to have that finished. And so they wrote verses 9 onwards in order to help us to say, no, the resurrection happened. It really was true. But Mark didn't want to do that, I believe. I believe what Mark wanted us to do was to now ask ourselves the question, what are we going to do now? How are we going to respond to the fact that Jesus has overcome evil? Are we going to keep quiet, or are we going to go and tell everyone? And in many ways, I believe that's really the outcome of discipleship. That discipleship that grows us in relationship to God is not enough. Because discipleship needs to end with us seeking to go out and tell that story to others. We need to remember that, in fact, the greatest tool of evangelism is not the Bible, but us. Sharing our faith, sharing our belief, sharing our knowledge that God has sent Jesus and that Jesus is the good that overcomes evil. Jesus is the one who actually restores relationship. And what we need to do is not run away in fear, but actually stand up boldly and say, I believe this. What Mark wants to do is he's wanting to teach us. He's wanting to grow us into discipleship through this concept of secrecy, but only until the resurrection. At the resurrection, he wants to then offer us a choice. He wants to say, you've heard the story. You've grown in the story now. Now what are you going to do? Are you going to just hide in fear? Or are you going to stand and tell others about Jesus Christ? The one who has come to overcome evil. And the one through his resurrection who has overcome the evil that we see in our world.